Thunder on the Right by Alan Crawford, Chapter 8. Read by Fax Fivem. Chapter 8, The Rage Against Leviathan, opening with the following quotes.
King George is alive and well in Washington.
Former L.A. Police Chief Ed Davis.
Our enemy, the state.
The title of a book from 1935 by Albert J. Nock. The New Right, a political revolt of the insecure and resentful, is the result, at least in part, of the incapacity of its adherents to come to terms with modern society, with the corporate state, with large business institutions, and with the organized labor movement. Despite their talk of defending free enterprise and sympathizing with the working man, the New Right is deeply distrustful of institutions that exist to support business and labor. Since the free enterprise they evoke is largely mythic and cannot be said to exist anywhere in the world, which Paul Weyrich of the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress readily admits, their movement is utopian and, as such, precisely the contrary of true conservatism. The remedy they prescribe for complex economic and social problems is the destruction of the welfare state, another utopian vision. Their apparently paradoxical defense of unbridled capitalism and, at the same time, of the blue-collar factory worker is not cynical, but a manifestation of a deep ideological confusion that is characterized, nevertheless, by a certain consistency. That consistency is a hostility to bigness, extending, it seems, to all social and political institutions, except the defense establishment. The defense establishment, they believe, is necessary to ward off a far greater evil, the monstrous superstate of the Soviet Union. Bigness in government and in labor unions has become badness to the New Right. And having discovered that modern capitalism, with its international contracts and government subsidies, is a partner, not an enemy, of big government, the New Right now sees big business as ominous as well. Business, unable to permit government to withdraw from its so-called intervention in the marketplace, has come to welcome regulation, which frequently protects existing industries and discourages competitive newcomers, thus encouraging the enmity of the New Right. Until the New Deal, business was seen as a defender of individualism and as a bulwark against the rise of the welfare state. Now business seems to the right to be a collaborator. The proliferating federal bureaucracy has also come to symbolize for the New Right a vast, unresponsive state that oppresses lower middle-class Americans, a slow-moving Goliath of unelected civil servants who are, more and more, assuming authority once vested in elected officials. Bureaucracy is distant from the people, faceless, anonymous, enormous, bumbling yet authoritarian, playing an ever greater role in the everyday lives of citizens. They see the bureaucracy, like the Supreme Court, as an intermediary institution that intervenes between the people and their elected representatives. While many Americans see the rise of the affirmative state or the service state or the welfare state as a costly and inefficient but generally benevolent presence, the New Right sees a Leviathan so gigantic and all-powerful as to engulf the nation, sapping the soul of the society, and existing for the benefit of a small clique of leaders of big government, big business, big labor, and recently, big media. This revolt against these four boogeymen is, however, a revolt not only against bigness, but all institutions, all orderly, stabilizing structures, in favor of amorphous, undefined, but emotional attachments, an antisocial, anti-political, anti-conservative impulse linked to the New Right's emerging preference, see Chapter 13, for methods of direct rather than representative democracy. In December of '78, a story in the New Right report suggested the New Right's view of power of the federal bureaucracy under the following headline:
Mrs. Ted Stevens, another victim of big government.
It reported that,
while the bureaucrats of the Federal Election Commission intended no such result, the wife of Senator Ted Stevens, Republican from Alaska, is dead because of a little power grab by the FEC.
The New Right report stated that Stevens had convinced his daughter to postpone her wedding because the FEC had ruled that costs would be counted as campaign expenditures.
Had the long arm and small mind of the federal bureaucracy not been involved, the wedding would have taken place in the fall as intended, when the weather would have been better.
Alerted by the senator's office that they had seriously botched the facts, the editors later printed a retraction. The New Right would like the federal bureaucracy dismantled, transferring, as Weyrich put it, much of the functions of federal agencies
to the private sector.
The traditional model. For most Americans, conservatism has perhaps been best understood as a political and economic philosophy rooted in big business and against big government and big labor, for the rich, against the poor. For decades, conservative Republican politicians did serve the interests of business. Old Guard Republicanism and the Old Right conservatism embraced a U.S. Chamber of Commerce, if not Chase Manhattan Bank, veneration of business interests,
disposable income,
the role of profits, and the necessity of economic growth and technological progress. For conservatives concerned with social mobility and individual opportunity, free enterprise was the key to getting ahead. A song of young Americans for freedom was only partly in jest.
God bless free enterprise, system divine. Stand beside her, don't deride her, just so long as the profits are mine.
Even that individualist conservatism was a corruption of classic conservatism, which rejected what Peter Viereck called
the rival materialisms, Marxism and laissez-faire capitalism.
Traditional American conservative thought, represented by Russell Kirk, understood that laissez-faire did not derive from conservatism, but from Gladstone and Manchester liberalism in England, and Jacobinism in France. As Viereck has written,
wherever the armies of the anti-conservative French Revolution went, one of their first thoughts was to abolish the allegedly outworn guilds and establish laissez-faire. This was their means of establishing the middle-class power.
Traditionalists like Kirk and Viereck, dominant in England and on the European continent, placed the highest value on an orderly society, one that was often hierarchical, stressing community, stability, and social harmony, without which they believed a free society was impossible. Freedom could not be both ends and means. Conservatives like Disraeli sought to ameliorate the vast upheaval of the Industrial Revolution, while liberals like Gladstone celebrated its progress. Milton Friedman, guru of free enterprise philosophy and an advisor in '64 to Senator Barry Goldwater, freely acknowledges the liberal political origins of free enterprise in his book Capitalism and Freedom, 1975, identifying the values he espouses as liberalism.
As it developed in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the intellectual movement that went under the name of liberalism emphasized freedom as the ultimate goal and the individual as the ultimate entity in society. It supported laissez-faire at home as a means of reducing the role of the state in economic affairs, and thereby enlarging the role of the individual. It supported free trade abroad as a means of linking the nations of the world together peacefully and democratically. In political matters, it supported the development of representative government and of parliamentary institutions, reduction in the arbitrary power of the state, and protection of the civil freedoms of individuals.
Thus, the chief spokesman for right-wing economics is a self-described liberal. The traditional American conservatives like Kirk, however, feared the dynamism of unbridled capitalism. Kirk once said that the American economy might be
too efficient for life on a truly human scale,
criticizing what Robert Nisbet called
the corrosive antisocial laissez-faire of the 19th century.
It has weakened social bonds, he said, and accelerated
the aggrandizement of the omnicompetent state,
correctly noting that economic questions concern nothing short of the relationship of man to the state. Whittaker Chambers once informed William F. Buckley, Jr., that if conservatives did not address the dynamism of the American economy, which he called
profoundly anti-conservative,
conservatism in America would be
foredoomed to futility and petulance.
Later, Buckley himself chastised Freeman for elevating the free market system to a
dogmatic theology.
With champions like Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan, the individualist libertarian impulse prevailed over the traditionalist school, which, lacking a constituency, has survived, if at all, almost as an intellectual underground. It is from that individualist impulse, extending beyond Goldwater and Reagan, that the profoundly anti-political nature of the New Right has derived, resulting in hostility to the government and to the political function itself. Revolt against the marketplace. The New Right's growing hostility does have historical precedents. Midwestern GOP conservatives like Robert Taft traditionally expressed a gnawing antipathy for large business institutions associated with New York City, the Eastern Seaboard, and the banks. Conservative Republicans, while generally sympathetic to business, grew resentful of the Rockefeller forces at Republican conventions, which internationalist in their attitudes opposed the Midwestern conservatives. They became increasingly suspicious of business as it adjusted profitably to the growth of big government. Greg Hilton, executive director of the Conservative Victory Fund and the son of a millionaire multinational businessman with offices in New York's Pan Am building, has rejected his father's liberalism and his father's view of business and government.
The establishment has changed,
Hilton told me.
It used to be conservative. It was pro-free enterprise, anti-government. But today it's pro-government, anti-free enterprise. Business today, as my father practices it, is tied up with the government, dependent on government for cooperation in its international dealings, subsidies, grants, you name it. As you might guess, my dad is a Rockefeller Republican and something of a liberal, but I'm not. I don't agree with his partnership of government and business, and I'm a conservative. I'm for competition and free enterprise. He's not.
This realization is coupled with the new right's status, concerns, and their desire to bolster their ranks by appealing to Wallaceite Democrats and the blue-collar workers. As Republican activist Julian Gammon told me,
What you have to realize is the new right types don't like big business for reasons that they don't have a great deal to do with economics or public policy. These people don't like business generally because it conjures up all kinds of associations they don't like. Ivy League educators, Wall Street, New York banks, internationalism, old wealth as opposed to nouveau or riche. Many of these new right people, after all, seem to come from lower middle-class backgrounds, and these things make them kind of uncomfortable.
In a
Bill of indictment,
Pat Buchanan in Conservative Digest summarized complaints against business. He cited
the obscene haste with which big business acts to meet Soviet requests for the latest in Western machinery or technology,
quoting Alexander Solzhenitsyn's speeches in the United States that referred to the
alliance between our communist leaders and your capitalists.
Conservatives, neoconservatives, and new rightists alike have viewed with similar dismay the eagerness of American corporations to help build the Soviet war machine and to trade with mainland China and more recently Castro's Cuba. Reporting from Havana in '78, Alan Reichsand, Human Events' Washington editor, described the business executives who participated with him in the East-West Trade Council excursion.
Like the communist Lenin and the capitalist Schumpeter, the Cubans believe the businessmen will sell the rope for their own execution. And many of the capitalists I traveled with furnished little evidence to disabuse the Cubans of this notion. Whether they considered themselves hard-headed or anti-communist or liberal, they were eagerly seeking profits, and most seemed particularly uncomfortable when politically sensitive subjects were raised, apparently on the grounds that it might queer any trade deal.
Business interests have failed Americans on the domestic front as well, Buchanan wrote, by their participation in a menage-a-trois with
radical politics and hardcore pornography.
While conservative pro-business publications like National Review are barely able to sustain themselves financially, Buchanan complained many corporations, whose existence the conservative publications defend, pay millions of dollars each year to purchase advertisements in Playboy, Penthouse, Rolling Stone, and other publications, in effect
subsidizing and contributing to the degradation of moral values,
as well as providing a forum for opinions often hostile to capitalism. The October '76 issue of Penthouse, he noted, featured a full-page advertisements from major American businesses, along with an interview with radical activist Tom Hayden, who argued that Americans
must confront the concentration of economic power and wealth in this country and smash the system that gives rise to war.
Another issue of that same magazine described Cesar Chavez of the United Farm Workers as
one of the few uncorrupted heroes we have left, a continuing inspiration to common people everywhere who are being ripped off by mindless corporations.
Perhaps Buchanan wrote mindless is an accurate description of the producers of Jim Beam, Wild Turkey, Smirnoff Vodka, Benson, and Hedges, and others who advertise in such publications. The worst fears of the new rightists were confirmed in April of '79 when Joseph Coors' Colorado brewery purchased advertisements in The Advocate, a leading newspaper for homosexuals, informing readers that the company
does not discriminate on the basis of sexual preference, and neither the Coors family nor the company has ever donated one dime to Anita Bryant or the Briggs Initiative or in any way supported these types of campaigns.
Articles in the issue were devoted to
the lesbian legacy and coming to grips with sadomasochism.
Coors himself was promptly denounced by the Reverend Jerry Falwell and Briggs himself, whose comments were quoted in the Spotlight, the monthly newspaper of the far-right Liberty Lobby.
The fact that Coors would lend support to the homosexual community and solicit their economic participation degrades them, in my opinion, to the lowest echelon of their industry,
Falwell told the Spotlight. American business interests, in the view of the new right, have aided and abetted a domestic enemy more awesome than the skin magazines or homosexual news sheets, creating through their advertising dollars a monster institution oppressing the people, big media.
Conservative resentment of big business,
According to Buchanan, is caused also by the fact that
our common adversary, the networks and the national press, are being subsidized by the advertising dollars of the Fortune 500.
right-wing animosity towards the networks is nothing new, but a common hostility towards business and the media is. Since most Americans, up to 75% by some accounts, rely on the network news as their primary source of information about their government and society, they are, Buchanan believes, exposed to views that are
well to the left of the electorate,
especially in the case of views towards business. New right opinions get such short shrift on television, William Rusher argued in The Making of the New Majority Party, that the fairness doctrine, generally viewed by conservatives as an unwarranted example of meddlesome governmental regulation, should be vigorously enforced to redress the imbalance.
Beyond that, the antitrust laws already on the books can and should be used to prevent any single individual or corporation from acquiring a monopoly position through multiple ownership of newspapers, radio, and TV stations in a given area.
Rusher tends to support
busting up big media.
American corporations, the new right believes, simply lack the foresight and common sense to defend their own interests. In addition to subsidizing the major networks and the glossy publications like Penthouse and Playboy, they also pour millions of dollars into the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, although, as Buchanan said,
left-wing journalists have turned public television into their private pork barrel.
They subsidize American colleges and universities,
where America's past is derided in the history department as racist and imperialist, and America's free enterprise system is damned in the Department of Economics as exploitative and unjust.
In short, while
the conservative community and the business community have long confronted a common foe, the conservative, at considerable political cost, has been battling that foe while the businessman has been trying to buy him off.
This is nowhere so apparent as in the way corporations and their affiliated political arms contribute to political candidates. Business interests, rather than spending their money to elect pro-business candidates to public office, often invest in incumbents regardless of their political records. In 1977, Conservative Digest, relying on research by the New Right Report, reported that a number of political action committees tied to the business organizations gave an overwhelming percentage of their contribution to Democrats. The U.S. League of Savings Associations, for instance, contributed $129,190 to political candidates, 79.7% of whom were Democrats, many of them liberals. The American Optometric Association contributed 85.6% of its $175,019 to Democrats as well. As the New Right Report editor Morton Blackwell wrote,
the shocking fact is that, with some notable exceptions, corporations and associations have compiled a sorry record of inactivity, waste, and self-destructive support of their enemies. Most of the existing business-oriented PACs put their money on powers that be. Their pattern of giving shows they were lobbying, not trying to elect legislators with a pro-free enterprise philosophy. Many of the corporate and association PACs gave most of their money to the same liberals who were receiving major support from big labor. In many cases, the pattern was pronounced. Those handing out the corporate and association PAC money were activist liberals, hostile to the maintenance of the free enterprise system.
The conclusion was inescapable.
The time has come,
Buchanan wrote,
for conservatives to end their politically costly, all too often uncritical support for big business, and to draft new treaty terms for the old alliance.
The right can no longer afford to be perceived as
the obedient foot soldiers of the Fortune 500.
There was an undeniable hint of cynicism in all this, though much sincerity too.
The time has come to get the Fortune 500 off our backs,
Nevada Senator Paul Laxalt began telling audiences.
In the past, we conservatives paraded all those Chamber of Commerce candidates with the Mobile Oil billboards strapped to their backs.
Paul Weyrich told Time, and it didn't work. Buchanan, writing in his nationally syndicated newspaper column, observed that for years Republicans has fought as volunteers in businesses' battles, a pattern that would soon end.
Whether the adversary be organized labor or disorganized demonstrator, Naderite or radical, socialist or environmentalist, big business could rely upon its Republican infantry to close ranks and march across that wheat field up Cemetery Hill. Where has the alliance gotten the GOP? Indelibly identified as the party of the privileged, the party of the country club conservative, the party of big business.
The oil companies came under increasing attack as profits soared in 78 and 79. Laxalt, national chairman of Ronald Reagan's 76 bid for the Republican presidential nomination, made headlines calling for independent audits of the major oil companies. Kevin Phillips noted that activists of the right who attacked
multinational corporations, suing to block ambassadorial appointments for bank directors, and doing a host of other things,
are coming
surprisingly close to the tradition of the old Western GOP progressives, the Hiram Johnsons and the William Borahs.
Many of the new critics of big business were, like Laxalt, from western states. Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah, for example, called business leaders
gutless wonders. Too many of our top corporate leaders,
he said,
are inheritors who have never known what it's like to put everything on the line to meet a payroll.
Not a little disturbed by these developments was John Chamberlain, the respected conservative journalist and literary critic who detected a
distinct whiff of a new right-wing populism
at the 77 Conservative Political Action Conference in Washington. The danger, Chamberlain wrote, is that
this campaign against big business will become indiscriminate.
True conservatives, he warned, should take a long, hard look at the system within which these reviled business leaders must operate or risk
untold damage to the freewheeling atmosphere that made American production the envy of the world.
In the contemporary business world, that of the corporate state, the executive
must answer to government for all his personnel policies, hiring, firing, promotion, wages, pensions, and unionization. He must kowtow to the Security and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Internal Revenue Service. He cannot merge with another company or acquire a new subsidiary without consulting the Department of Justice. He must put up with OSHA and submit his advertising and sales practices to the FTC for ratification. He is restricted in his use of land and must bow to the environmentalists even when they are crazy. And he must raise capital in a world that discriminates against profits and no longer supports the sanctity of contracts.
The new right, in other words, must come to terms with the corporate state, with a world far more complex than most new rightists are accustomed to. As the American economy has passed through the industrial age and into a post-industrial one, it has long since ceased to be primarily entrepreneurial in nature, and such paeans to free enterprise appear increasingly romantic and utopian. This attachment to free enterprise, Senator Schmidt has described today's big businessmen as
supporters of incumbents who are tearing down our free enterprise system,
and fundraiser Richard A. Viguerie has said that his economic views
are that of traditional economic conservative laissez-faire minimum government interference in our lives.
According to conservative author Richard Whalen,
spares them the difficulty of serious thought.
But serious thought assumes that their attitudes towards business are primarily economic. The attitudes of the new right towards big business are rather primarily political manifestations of deep-seated hostility to large institutions that threaten their romantic individualism. Upheaval versus order. In the unexamined ideology of the new right, there are many apparent inconsistencies. While the new rightists attack big business and the corporate state, they are nevertheless intolerant of the trade union movement, which has evolved to redress the imbalance between the individual worker who, like the new rightist, feels threatened by large institutions and the business community. Organizations like the Americans Against Union Control of Government and the National Right to Work Committee fight the organized labor movement, depicting it as big labor run by labor bosses and union goonism. They continue to resist institutions like the trade union movement, despite their function of restoring to the individual worker some control over his own life, at a time, ironically, when the Republican Party and groups like the American Enterprise Institute are coming to a more enlightened view on unions. The new rightists invariably point to Great Britain as a society ruined by the growing power of labor, forgetting the conservative defense of organized labor and Frank Tannenbaum's A New Philosophy of Labor, In an age which the extended family has disintegrated under the pressure of industrialism,
the union returns to the worker his society. Institutionally, the trade union movement is an unconscious effort to harness the drift of our time and reorganize it around the cohesive identity that men working together always achieve. Trade unionism is the conservative movement of our time. It is the counter-revolution. Unwittingly, it has turned its back on most of the political and economic ideas that have nourished Western Europe and the United States during the last 2 centuries. In practice, though, not in words, it denies the heritage that stems from the French Revolution and from English liberalism. It is also a complete repudiation of Marxism.
organized labor, in that view, is one of the institutions in society that create order within chaos and give meaning to the lives of those who are a part of it. The New Right's anti-conservative ideology rebels against it. Though sympathetic to the individual worker and the individual businessman, the kind
who's met a payroll,
the New Right rebels against the institutions, the organized labor movement and the large corporation in which the businessman and laborer function. The New Right's radical individualism and its anti-institutional impulse mitigate against order and stability and encourage rootlessness and upheaval, the inevitable consequence of the free enterprise the New Right champions. The New Rightists have thus become the celebrants of change, of rootlessness, of progress, all that classical conservatives deplore. It's a reversal of roles. Progress, as Gary Wills has noted, has generally been a
liberal preserve,
and only recently has been seized upon by right-wingers who now accuse their liberal opponents of a
failure of nerve,
and a lack of will and a lack of confidence in their ability to face the challenges of the future. Many contemporary liberals have come to embrace
no growth,
economics, austerity,
limits,
while right-wingers assert that whatever is technologically possible ought to be done. In the case of nuclear power, for example, liberals are urging caution and prudence, right-wingers urging enterprise. There's a footnote here which reads as follows. Involved in the New Right's determination to go forward with nuclear power and other technological advances, it seems, is a concern that America remain a world leader, and a fear that, without nuclear power, the U.S. will be continually dependent upon other, often hostile countries for its energy resources. America, they believe, must remain number one. Along similar lines, right-wingers have mercilessly ridiculed so-called eco-freaks, their term for environmentalists, those, in their view, who are dedicated to keeping things as they are. In his ability to uphold the non-Manchester liberal conservatism of Burke, Disraeli, Irving Babbitt, and others that George F. Will, the New Right's least favorite conservative pundit, has made such a significant contribution. Will, in what is considered an unfathomable heresy, takes issue with the New Right's individualist, democratic ideology and, in particular, its notion of the government as Leviathan. At once avoiding the romanticism of some of the dreamier post-war conservative traditionalists, Will is upheld within a distinctly American context, the strain of conservatism that is, in economics, neither plutocratic nor populist. Criticized by many right-wing activists, he has unapologetically conceded that his conservatism is not theirs. Theirs, he has written, is not conservatism at all, but
a radically anti-political ideology, decayed Jeffersonianism characterized by a frivolous hostility toward the state, and lacking the traditional conservative appreciation of the dignity of the political vocation and the grandeur of its responsibilities.
These self-styled conservatives assume that
a large government is an inherently liberal device, inherently hostile towards conservative values. But this is only true if freedom is the only conservative value, and if freedom means only the absence of restraints applied by government. And if that is what conservatism asserts, it is a stone-cold anachronism, as dead as the 19th century liberalism it resembles. It is an apolitical philosophy irrelevant to the government that has evolved in response to Americans' desires.
True conservatives
distrust and try to modulate social forces that work against the conservation of traditional values. But for a century, the dominant conservatism has uncritically worshipped the most transforming force, the dynamism of the American economy.
This uncritical worship of
free enterprise, institutionalized restlessness, an engine of perpetual change,
has led to
an anarchy of self-interestedness
that may have reached its low in the much publicized tax revolt. Even before Proposition 13 swept to victory in California, Will wrote,
"What is called conservatism might better be called infantilism. Those of us blessed with small children recognize childishness when we see it. Increasingly the nation, like a child, wills the end without willing the means to the end. The end is a full platter of government services. The means to that end is the energetic government that does the inevitable regulating and taxing. Today's so-called conservatism, the average voter has looked into his heart of hearts, prayed long and hard, and come to the conclusion that it is high time for the government to cut his neighbor's benefits."
Support of this individualistic free enterprise politics, writes British Tory Henry Farline, is
untenable
for true conservatives. American
free enterprisers
have become champions of the
unrestrained individualism that has always been opposed by traditional conservatism. To almost all that the English conservatism has always loathed in Adam Smith, especially his view of man as individualistic and hedonistic, competitive and acquisitive, the American conservative gives his support.
The American New Rightist, therefore, has placed himself in the unfortunate position, one wholly at odds with traditional conservatism,
of defending a society of isolated atoms with too little sense of himself as a social being and a public.
This kind of conservative
is reduced to defending the private at the cost of the public, the individual at the cost of the social, self-interest at the cost of communal interest. In short, his concerns are the very opposite of what they should be.
The New Rightist's view of his own government as Leviathan and his rage against it are natural outgrowths of his radical individualism, and being anti-political, render him impotent before it.